The accountant's voice was shaking when he called me. "Maya, I need you to come into the office right now," he said. "Your brother filed paperwork yesterday transferring your father's entire hardware store into his name alone, and the notary stamp on that document doesn't exist." I checked. I was standing in my kitchen holding a mug of coffee that went cold in my hand because 3 months after burying my father, my own brother had forged his way into owning everything Dad spent 31 years building, and he almost got away with it by one signature I never gave. If you've ever had someone in your own family try to erase you on paper, stay with me, because this story has a very specific ending. And if these stories are the reason you keep coming back, go ahead and subscribe now, because there's more where this came from. My name is Maya. My father built Reyes Hardware from a single rented storefront into the kind of place 3 generations of our town relied on, and when he passed, I thought grief was going to be the hardest part. I was wrong. I didn't expect the hardest part to come from someone who shared my last name. My father Manuel opened the store the year I was born, and for as long as I can remember, it smelled like sawdust and WD-40, and the coffee he brewed too strong every morning at 6. My older brother Ray worked there on and off through his 20s, mostly when he needed money between other plans that never quite worked out. I was the one who actually stayed. I got my business degree specifically so I could help Dad modernize the inventory system, and for the last 9 years, I'd worked there full-time, unpaid overtime, included while Ray drifted in and out depending on what he needed that month. Dad never wrote a formal will, which I know now was his first mistake, though. At the time, it just felt like something we'd deal with eventually, the way families put off uncomfortable paperwork when everyone assumes there's plenty of time left. He'd say things like, "You two will figure it out, you always have." And I believed him because for most of our lives, Ray and I had figured things out fine. Growing up, Ray and I actually got along well enough. He was 4 years older, the kind of brother who taught me to ride a bike in the store's back parking lot, and let me tag along to the movies with his friends when I was too young to really belong there. Somewhere in his late 20s, though, something shifted a string of jobs that never lasted a business idea involving imported tools that cost Dad $11,000, and folded within a year, a general drift that Dad covered for quietly the way parents do, hoping the next attempt would be the one that stuck. I never resented Ray for any of it while Dad was alive. It was Dad's money, Dad's patience, Dad's choice to keep extending both. It only started to feel different once the store itself was on the line. What I didn't know was that 6 weeks before Dad died, he'd been fighting pancreatic cancer for 8 months by then, and the last few weeks were a blur of hospital rooms and medication schedules Ray had asked him to sign what Dad apparently believed was a healthcare proxy update. Dad was heavily medicated most of those final weeks. He trusted Ray to handle the paperwork because I was the one handling everything else. His meals, his appointments, the store's daily operations so it didn't collapse while he was in the hospital. I found out about the proxy document by accident actually going through Dad's desk about a month after the funeral looking for the store's insurance policy. It was just a single page, Dad's signature shaky but real at the bottom, dated 5 weeks before he died. I didn't think much of it at the time beyond a small twist of sadness at how weak his handwriting had gotten. I filed it back where I found it and went back to running the store because someone had to, and Ray had already stopped showing up 3 days after the funeral. I remember exactly where I was standing when I found it, the third drawer of his old oak desk, the one that always stuck a little and needed a firm tug to open. There was a photo of the 3 of us tucked in that same drawer, taken maybe 15 years earlier at a company picnic Dad used to throw for employees every summer, back when the store was doing well enough to afford things like that. Ray was grinning in the photo arm slung around my shoulders. I sat on the floor of Dad's office for a while, looking at that photo, before I even opened the proxy document, which is maybe why the shaky signature didn't alarm me the way it probably should have. I was still thinking about the boy in that photo, not the man who'd stopped answering my calls within a week of the funeral. I didn't know that page was the first thread in something much bigger. I wouldn't understand what it actually was until the accountant called. There's a detail I keep coming back to from those final weeks, one that felt insignificant at the time. Dad kept a small leather ledger on his nightstand at the hospital, the same kind he'd used at the store since before I was born, where he tracked things in his own shorthand deliveries, vendor calls, reminders. About a week before he died, he wrote a single line in it that I only found months later. Talk to both kids together. Don't let R handle alone. I don't know if he sensed something, or if it was just an old man's instinct toward fairness after a lifetime of running a business the right way. But he never got the chance to have that conversation, because 3 days after he wrote it, his condition worsened fast enough that clear conversations of any kind became rare. I think about that line often now. It tells me Dad wasn't naive about his sons and daughters and how they might handle things without him watching. He just ran out of time to act on what he already suspected. The store kept running because I kept it running. I opened at 7 every morning, handled payroll for our 4 employees, dealt with vendors who'd worked with my father for 2 decades, and now looked at me like they weren't sure who was actually in charge. Ray showed up maybe once every 2 weeks, usually, to ask if there was any cash in the register he could borrow against, and I usually said yes because he was my brother, and because some part of me still wanted to believe we'd sort out the business together once the sharpest edge of grief had dulled. About 10 weeks after the funeral, Ray started talking differently. He'd stop by and make comments like, "You know, Dad always said this place needed a real business. Mind running it, not just someone clocking in hours, which stung, because clocking in hours was exactly what I'd been doing for 9 straight years while he came and went." I let it slide the first few times. Grief makes people say strange things, I told myself. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon in November, Ray walked into the store with a manila folder and told our longtime store manager, Teresa, that there'd be some changes to the paperwork this week and that she should direct any ownership questions to him going forward. Teresa called me the second he left, confused, because as far as she knew, ownership hadn't been settled between us at all. Teresa had worked at the store for 12 years, since before I'd even finished college, and she knew our family's rhythms better than most relatives did. He didn't even ask how the Miller order was going, she told me on the phone, still sounding rattled. He walked past the whole floor like he already owned it and went straight to announcing paperwork. Your dad never once talked to me like that, not on his worst day. That detail stuck with me more than I expected it to, not the paperwork itself, but the tone. Ray had apparently used the tone of someone who'd already decided the outcome and was just informing people of it rather than discussing it. I called Ray that night. What changes? What paperwork? Dad handled it before he died, Ray said, and his voice had a flatness to it I didn't recognize. The store's mine now. He signed it over. I've got the documentation, Maya, it's done. He signed what over? When? Does it matter? It's handled. You can still work there if you want. Obviously, I'm not going to kick you out. But it's mine on paper now, and I think it's time we're honest about the fact that Dad always saw me as the one who'd eventually run this place. He saw you as the one who showed up when you needed cash, I said before I could stop myself. I've opened that store every single morning for 9 years, Ray. I redid the entire inventory system by myself while he was in chemo. Where exactly does always saw you as the one fit into any of that? You always made it about the hours you put in, Ray said. Dad wanted someone with vision for the place, not just someone clocking in. That's not a knock on you. It's just the truth. I hung up before I said something I couldn't take back, and I sat on my kitchen floor for a long time afterward, running through 9 years of 6 a.m. openings and Ray's occasional 3-week appearances, trying to figure out how someone with vision fit into any version of reality either of us had actually lived. The store Dad built, the $68,000 in inventory I'd personally reorganized after his diagnosis, the relationships with vendors I'd rebuilt from scratch when half of them assumed the business would fold without him. All of it apparently now belonged to a man who'd shown up sporadically for a decade and vanished within 72 hours of the funeral. I didn't sleep much that week. I kept thinking about that healthcare proxy page in Dad's desk, the shaky signature, and a question I couldn't shake. What exactly had Ray actually gotten my father to sign in those final medicated weeks? And was it really what either of them thought it was? I went to the store the next morning anyway because customers didn't know or care about our family's paperwork disputes, and the shelves still needed stocking. Teresa found me in the back office around 9, staring at a stack of vendor invoices without actually reading any of them. "He can't just walk in here and say it's his," she said quietly, closing the door behind her. "Your dad talked to me about this place more than he ever talked to Ray. He used to say you had his instincts for it." I didn't tell her about the county recorder's office yet because I didn't have anything concrete to tell her. I just nodded and went back to the invoices, and for the first time since the funeral, I let myself sit in the office chair that still smelled faintly like Dad's aftershave and cry for about 4 minutes before wiping my face and going back out to the floor because a delivery truck was waiting and somebody had to sign for it. Before I tell you what the accountant found, I want to know if your sibling tried to quietly write you out of a family business on paper, would you have confronted them immediately? Or waited to gather proof first the way I did? Let me know in the comments. Dad's accountant, a careful, soft-spoken man named Arthur Whitman, who'd handled the store's books for almost 20 years, called me 11 days after that phone call with Ray. He'd received a request from Ray's lawyer to update the business registration and tax filings to reflect sole ownership, and standard procedure meant reviewing the transfer documentation before making any changes on his end. "Something's wrong with this notarization," Arthur told me in the flat, careful tone of a man who deals in numbers, because numbers don't lie to him. The transfer document lists a notary named Dolores Fenwick, stamp number 4471. I called the county clerk's office to verify the stamp is active because I do that for every transfer over $100,000 habit, honestly more than suspicion. Stamp 4471 was reported lost and deactivated 14 months before this document was supposedly notarized. I didn't fully understand what that meant at first. Arthur explained it slowly, the way you'd explain something to someone still catching up. Someone had used a notary stamp that legally shouldn't have existed anymore on a document dated 3 weeks before my father died, transferring full ownership of a $340,000 business into Ray's name alone. Either the notarization was fabricated entirely, or someone had gotten hold of a stamp that was supposed to have been destroyed. Arthur wouldn't process anything based on a document he couldn't verify, and he told me plainly that I had every right to request a formal investigation through the county recorder's office before any transfer became official. "I've known your father 20 years, Maya," he said. "I'm not going to be the one who lets a piece of paper like this go through without someone looking harder at it first." I drove to the county recorder's office myself 2 days later, and it turned out Arthur's instinct was worth more than he probably realized. Dolores Fenwick, the notary listed on the document, had retired to Arizona 3 years earlier and hadn't notarized anything in this county since. When I called the number listed for her old office, it now belonged to an entirely different business. When I finally tracked down Dolores herself through a mutual contact of Arthur's, she confirmed she had never met my father, never notarized any document for our family, and had reported her old stamp lost when her office closed. Dolores was kind about it, actually, once she understood what had happened. "People don't realize how often this happens with older stamps," she told me over the phone, her voice carrying the particular patience of someone who'd clearly explained this before. "A stamp doesn't just disappear when you retire. If it's not properly surrendered, it can end up anywhere. I reported mine lost the year I moved, but the county's tracking on old equipment isn't always as tight as people assume." She offered to provide a signed statement confirming she'd never notarized anything for our family, and that statement ended up being one of the most important pieces of paper in the entire case, because it came from someone with no reason at all to lie for either me or Ray. Someone had forged not just my father's intent, but an entire notarization to make it look official. I sat with that fact for 2 days before I said anything to Ray, because I wanted to understand exactly how deep this went, before I gave him any warning that I knew. Those 2 days were some of the strangest of my life. I kept the store running exactly as normal, said good morning to Ray. When he stopped by on the second day, watched him make small talk with a vendor about a delivery schedule, all while carrying a folder in my car, with proof his entire claim to the business was built on a stamp that legally didn't exist. Arthur told me to stay calm and let the paper trail build itself before confronting anyone. and I understood intellectually why that mattered. Emotionally sitting across from my brother while he asked if we still had his favorite brand of coffee filters in stock, it took everything in me not to ask him right then whose idea the notary stamp had actually been. What I found going back through Dad's final hospital records with Arthur's help was that the healthcare proxy I'd found in his desk, the one with Dad's genuinely shaky but real signature, had a second page. A page I'd never seen because it had been in a separate folder in Ray's car. Not Dad's desk, until Arthur's paralegal contact managed to get a copy from the hospital's own document log, since anything signed on hospital premises gets scanned into their system, regardless of what happens to the paper copy afterward. That second page was the actual business transfer stapled behind the healthcare proxy. So Dad, medicated and exhausted, would have signed both as a single set of papers, without necessarily registering that page 2 said something entirely different from page 1. Dad hadn't knowingly signed away the store. He'd signed a stack of papers his son handed him in a hospital bed, trusting the son sitting beside him the way you trust family when you're too tired and too sick to read every line yourself. I asked Arthur once all of this became clear why he'd bothered checking the notary stamp at all, since most transfers apparently go through without anyone verifying that level of detail. He told me it was something my father had actually taught him years earlier, back when Arthur was a much younger accountant just starting to handle small business accounts. Manuel used to say a signature only means something if everything underneath it is real, Arthur told me. He caught a supplier trying to shortchange him once decades ago over a discrepancy nobody else would have noticed. He drilled that habit into me without ever meaning to. I suppose in the end it came back around to protect the very thing he taught me to protect it for. That detail stayed with me longer than almost anything else in this whole ordeal, that some small, careful habit my father passed on, without ever explaining why, ended up being the exact thing that stopped his own son from erasing everything he'd built. I didn't confront Ray privately on a closed Sunday. I want to be honest about why. Ray had already scheduled something of his own, a new ownership announcement at the store's annual Customer Appreciation Day, an event Dad had run every spring for over a decade, complete with a local newspaper reporter, a dozen vendors, and half the town wandering through the aisles. Ray had told Teresa to prepare a small podium near the front register. He planned to introduce himself as the store's new sole owner in front of everyone Dad had spent 31 years serving. I let him plan it. I brought Arthur the notary verification and the hospital's document log, and I waited until Ray had actually stepped up to that podium, thanked the crowd for their loyalty, and started to say the words as the new owner of Reyes Hardware before I walked up beside him with a microphone I'd asked Teresa to have ready. Before Ray finishes that sentence, I said, and the room, maybe 40 people deep, went quiet, the way a store full of strangers goes quiet when they sense something real is happening. I want to make sure everyone here has accurate information, since a lot of you knew my father personally. Ray's face went through about 4 different expressions before he landed on defensive right there in front of the reporter's notebook. Maya, this isn't the place. You picked the place, I said. You picked Dad's own Customer Appreciation Day to announce this. I think that's actually the point. I held up the notary verification for the crowd, not reading every word just enough. This transfer document was notarized by a stamp that was reported lost 3 years before this paper was signed. The notary listed on it has never met my father. That's not a family disagreement. That's forgery, and the county recorder's office is already looking into it. I watched Arthur step forward quiet as always and confirm to the small crowd that he'd flagged the discrepancy formally weeks earlier. I watched the local reporter's pen start moving faster. I watched Teresa, standing near the register, finally let out a breath she'd apparently been holding for weeks. And I watched 40 people who'd trusted my father for decades look at Ray with an expression that told him more clearly than I ever could have privately exactly what they now understood about the paper he'd just tried to stand behind. Ray didn't finish his announcement. He set the microphone down, said something about letting the family sort this out, and left through the back before Customer Appreciation Day was even half over. Within 3 weeks, faced with a county inquiry into the fraudulent notarization and a town that had watched the whole thing unfold in real time, Ray agreed to void the transfer entirely and sign a new ownership document, one properly notarized, drawn up with an estate attorney splitting the business according to what Dad's actual uncontested wishes had been. Equal ownership, with operational control going to whoever was actually running daily operations, which by every employee's account, every vendor's account, and eventually Ray's own admission had been me the entire time. I still don't know for certain whether Ray forged the notary stamp himself or paid someone else to do it, and the county's investigation, last I heard, was still working through that question separately from our own family settlement. What I do know is that the next Customer Appreciation Day a year later, Ray wasn't there. And nobody in that store asked why. I used to think loyalty to family meant giving people the benefit of the doubt, even when the evidence in front of me said otherwise. What that podium taught me is that real loyalty to my father meant protecting what he actually built in front of the very community he built it for, not in some closed-door conversation nobody else would ever hear about. Ray and I still speak occasionally, mostly at holidays, and it's civil in the careful way things become civil. After something like this, not healed exactly, just managed. He works construction now somewhere across the state. I kept the ledger with Dad's handwriting in it on the same shelf behind the register where he always kept it, and some mornings opening up at 6, the way I have for going on 10 years now, I still reach for it out of habit before I remember he's not the one who's going to read it back to me. If someone has ever tried to rewrite your family's history on paper, while you were the one who actually showed up every single day, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments what happened and how you found out. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear that. Forged paperwork doesn't hold up against a careful accountant and a county recorder's office. And if you want more stories exactly like this one, make sure you're subscribed because next week's story might hit closer to home than you expect.